Hi everyone, so we will be discussing questions on labor market in this video. We will look at 3-4 exam papers which have come recently to discuss labor market essays. Uh, in June 2018, the question was, first part said this, that explain how a firm derives its demand curve for labor and consider how the structure of the product market in which the firm operates affects the demand curve for labor. So in this question, we're looking at derivation of the labor's demand, which is basically the MRP theory. What is MRP theory? Where it's basically MRP is equal to MP times MR, where MRP is the additional revenue that we get from hiring one extra worker. So it's the extra revenue from hiring one extra worker, which is dependent on or is a function of MP times MR, where MP is the extra output we get from hiring one extra worker and MR is the extra revenue from extra units sold. So when you look at MRP, we say this, that in perfect competition, when you look at the market structure being perfect competition, since P is equal to MR, MRP becomes MP times P. So if I have look at my MP curve is downward sloping because of the law of diminishing marginal return, which after some time makes the MP start to fall. My demand curve is perfectly elastic because I'm a price taker in a perfectly competitive setting, and this MP times this demand curve, which is the price, MP times P, I should write that P here, results in what we call another graph which looks like MP, but it's a different scale, which is called the MRP, which is MP times P. So in perfect competition, we say this, that the demand curve for labor is downward sloping because MRP is downward sloping, because MP is downward sloping. That makes the MRP downward sloping because demand curve is perfectly elastic for the product market. In imperfect market or labor, demand curve is downward sloping. We suggest that unlike the perfect competition where the demand curve is perfectly elastic, in this case demand curve is downward sloping. So even MR is downward sloping. So when you look at imperfect labor market, MRP will be equal to MP times MR, where not only MP is diminishing, like MP is falling, even MR is falling, as we can see from the diagram above. Hence, in an imperfect market, the demand curve for labor is downward sloping because both MP and MR are downward sloping. So that's the distinction we have to make in this graph, talking about MP and MR. Moving on, when we look at the next part of the question, it talks about discuss whether it's possible for trade union to negotiate higher wages and more employment. So this is the case where I talk about in my notes or in the videos that we made, the case 3 and case 4, which is trade union against monopsony and trade union against in a perfectly competitive setting. So let's look at this. So what are trade unions? We can define trade unions. Trade unions are a group of workers coming together and then doing collective bargaining. Through collective bargaining, they're trying to improve the wages, the working conditions, and employment level of the workers that they represent. Trade union can sort of occur in a perfectly competitive setting or in a bilateral monopoly. So we first talk about trade union in a perfectly competitive setting, and then bilateral monopoly, and then we can talk about the factors that can affect the power of trade union. So let's look at the first diagram, which is trade union in a perfectly competitive setting. In a perfectly competitive setting, the trade unions is setting a wage rate above equilibrium, and by doing so, if the demand and supply was like this in a perfect competition, you set a wage rate above equilibrium and you cause an unemployment equal to AB. So the total unemployment in this case will be Q0 minus Q2 minus Q1. That's the total unemployment, while Q0 minus Q1 are the people who will lose jobs. So if you go back to the question is saying whether it's possible for trade union to negotiate higher wages and more employment, and the answer is yes, it is, but the employment level will fall. So in this case, trade unions sort of ability to set the wage set the wage and the employment level both to go up will be limited. However, the more inelastic the demand curve, the higher the wages and the lower you will see the unemployment that will happen in this setting. However, employment will fall when the wage rates are set above equilibrium or above the competitive wage rate. In the case of bilateral monopoly, trade union is up against what we call the monopsony, and we say this that trade union can cause both employment to increase and the wage rate to increase depending on the bargaining power. So I'm going to make this diagram. I've done that earlier as well. Let's do it one more time. Let's say we are in a monopsony versus trade union situation. So I'm going to make a dotted supply for labor and a dotted marginal cost of labor. Okay, let's say the demand curve or MRP is like this, and currently the monopsony is paying where MC is equal to MRP, which is QM, and the wage rate is WM. Now if the trade union negotiates a wage rate above this, that's the trade union says give us the competitive wage rate or more. This means my new supply curve will become WT ASL, which means this part of my supply curve will no longer be valid because this part workers were not willing to work below WT. So all this X to A part will be what we call no longer valid, and because X to A part is no longer valid, X to B part will also not be valid because that's the part of the marginal cost that belongs to XA part of the supply curve, which is no longer valid. Why is that part no longer valid? Because the workers are saying we're not going to work any wage rate below WT, which means this wage rate will not exist. So this becomes a new supply curve, which is WTASL, while new marginal cost will be WTA, this part, plus B, so WTAB MCL. So now when we do MC is equal to MRP, wage rate will go up, employment level will go up, and ultimately we're looking at equilibrium to happen at point A. The question that we need to ask is basically if the trade union negotiates a wage rate above the competitive wage rate. Let's say the trade union says that we want a wage rate above the competitive. This is where we say this the wage rate will go up. For example, like look at this diagram. If we focus on this diagram, let's say this is my demand for labor, and the wage rates the trade union says we want a wage rate above. If that is the case, then you will have a situation where let's choose a color like this green color. Let's say if you have this wage rate above, the new supply curve will become something like this. W let's say X, or let's come up with another one, W high H, let's call it H SL. So this becomes the new supply curve, which means the MRP here, which means the wage rate does go up, but the quantity employed will fall. So the idea goes this, that any wage rate, and that could be a good conclusion that we can make, is that any wage rate above the competitive wage rate can cause wages to rise, but the unemployment level to be, or employment level to be lower. However, as long as the trade union negotiates a wage rate above the monopsony and towards the competitive wage rate, both wage rates and employment level will rise. Then we can talk about quickly, also conclude with saying that trade unions tend to be more powerful when A, there is more employment in the industry, because if there is more unemployment in the industry, employer will be powerful because he can, every time there is bargaining happening, that he can fire the workers and hire new workers. Similarly, we'll see trade unions to be more powerful when there is more inelastic demand for labor, because if there is more inelastic demand for labor, it will be difficult for us to replace labor with any other factor of production. And third is trade union will be also more powerful when they are dealing with a monopoly power rather than a perfectly competitive market, because the monopoly powers tend to have more money to give or more profitability, and that's why there's a possibility of bargaining for a higher wage rate than, let's say, if you are dealing with a perfectly competitive market employer who doesn't have that much money to give to start off with. In March 18, question number 4A was about MRP theory. So I want to discuss 4A now. But before I do that, let's read this. In 2016, a country's large yacht builder said it would have to make 350 people redundant. The company which builds luxury yachts said demand has decreased in the recession. So how do we use this to basically incorporate that to MRP theory? So we explained that MRP is simply MP times MR, where MR is simply extra revenue that we get from hiring one extra worker. So when we talk about this case where demand is going down for the product, we say basically explain what our MRP theory is, explain the idea that labor is a derived demand, right? So if, for example, and MR is simply is your price in a perfect competition, for example, but even if it's not a perfect competition, even if it's an imperfect competition, MR will change when the demand changes. So what is happening here is just that if labor is a derived demand, and let's say if there's a recession happening, and let's say demand falls, if the demand falls, then clearly MR falls, and if MR falls, clearly the demand for labor will fall. So once I've explained my MRP theory, once I've made my graphs, like for example my MP graph, my P graph, and my therefore MRP graph, which is also like this, we then explain the idea that demand falls, MR falls, because of which demand for labor will fall. So MRP can change because of two things, which is MP, which is the productivity of workers, and P, which is the price of the good, which is a function of demand. So you need to explain this kind of concept that if MP changes, demand for labor will change or shift. Similarly, if P changes, the demand for labor will shift. In question number 5 of November 17, they said the merit of economic theory of wage determination is that it clearly shows what the best level of wage rates should be, and thus is evidence that there is no need for either the government or the trade unions to fix wages. So there is the whole idea about what is fixed, but first thing first is that I'm going to talk about the 4 cases of wage determination, which is basically perfect competition labor market, then comes your monopsony, then comes your trade union versus monopsony, and then trade union in perfect competition. So we also talk about government intervention in the labor market. Now the question that we need to ask is basically, what is the best level for workers? So once you explain the idea of how wages are determined, what are best level of wages for workers, and the answer is that between perfect competition and monopsony, of course perfect competition will pay you more, but in the case of trade union, it's all about bargaining power, right? The wages could be as high as perfectly competitive, or even more, but definitely they will be, if there is bargaining power, will be better than the monopsony in that case. Also, government can intervene in markets where the wages are low, and they can set a wages also according to what government feels is a fair wage. In terms of employment, then we talk about this, that perfect competition leads to higher workers in monopsony, but trade union, depending on bargaining power, can also achieve that. Also, if the trade union asks for wages set above the competitive wage rate, it can cause unemployment to happen. So trade unions are not always what we call beneficial when they seek for higher wages, because that could also hurt the workers. For employers, well, the idea goes this: the best wage rate could be the one where they are paying the lowest, probably in the case of monopsony, but it all depends on labor market conditions, because the employer will be a profit maximizer irrespective of whatever market structure and conditions they will choose. So this question basically is asking us to talk about all the cases along with government intervention, and then look at what we feel is the best level of wage rates. But that best level means it's basically what we call normative, so we need to look at from whose perspective are we looking at, and then talk about how different market structures can be useful for different parties like workers and like from employers perspective. In June 17, 4B was labor market, which says this: in 2016, the trade unions called a strike of bus and train drivers after the demand for higher wages was rejected. Used economic theory of wages to discuss whether the demand for higher wages is likely to be successful. Again, this is a question of trade unions. Talk about role of trade union in perfect competition and in imperfect competition. Then talk about is that the question is asking about using economic theory whether the demand for higher wages is likely to be successful, and that basically depends on bargaining power, where the idea goes is that if the trade union has bargaining power, then the trade union can go for wages to rise. But then comes the question is that if the wages, if the wage rate rises above the competitive level, then wages will rise, but unemployment will also rise. Workers will lose employment if the wages are set above equilibrium or above the competitive level. So the idea goes is that we need to talk about the third and the fourth case of trade union power and how trade union can affect perfect competition setting. In a perfect competition setting wages above equilibrium and causing unemployment. So something like this, which we have discussed earlier as well, where you are setting a wage rate above equilibrium, but clearly the wages will go up. Here we also then wrap up by talking about when is trade union more powerful. Number one, it is more powerful when there is unemployment in the industry. Number two, when they are dealing with a monopoly, because that monopoly will have more money to give. And number three, when the trade union has labor that has inelastic demand, like trade union of doctors will be more successful, let's say, than trade union of let's say workers that have more elastic demand, let's say janitors.